You might read. I don't know why you're clapping. You don't know what's going to follow yet. Hope, indeed. Yeah. So you might reasonably be asking at this point why a philosopher, for such I am, who is entirely unqualified to talk about indulgences, is talking about them. Well, it's one of those things you have to blame social media for. So a few months ago now, there was a discussion of the kind of thing Margaret was talking about, the holy doors and indulgences, on Facebook. And Margaret saw that discussion, to which I contributed on Facebook, and asked me if I would come and repeat what I said on Facebook here. So the sins of social media multiply. That's one apology. The second apology is that...
Could I ask you to put the microphone just slightly down, because it's reverberating?
Okay, is that
That's
better?
Much better.
Okay, sorry about that. So the second apology is that I was ill in the week and therefore haven't prepared this as well as I might have done, but I do have a few notes and hopefully we'll get through it. So I think Margaret was kind when saying there was discussion about indulgences out there in the world. I think there's quite widespread suspicion or even opposition to the idea of indulgences within the Catholic Church as well as outside it, actually. And I've kind of got three suspicions as to why that is. The first is kind of obviously the history of abuse of indulgences, so the kind of pre-Reformation controversies around this. And these still have ramifications, these abuses. So I know someone who was a Catholic and has actually left the church, and whilst I don't think this was entirely the reason, they came across in their parish newsletter discussion of indulgences that were available at the cathedral. I think it was the last Jubilee year. And they reported to me that the Bishop of Portsmouth was selling indulgences. Now, the Bishop of Portsmouth was not, just in case anyone is from that diocese, was not selling indulgences. However, those associations of the doctrine and practice of indulgences with abuse are still there and go deep in some people. Secondly, and more substantially, I think, there's a view of indulgences as somehow transactional. I do something and God does something for me. Now, I don't think that's right. I'm going to go on to say what I think is in fact going on. But this idea that we can somehow treat God as though God were a slot machine, put something in, get something out. People worry about that, and they worry about that rightly, in my view. If that's what indulgences are about, then there is a problem, because God is certainly not something I can move to have mercy on me in a way that God is not already merciful towards me. And finally, I think indulgences can and are thought to be able to give rise to an unhealthy kind of spirituality, a spirituality of going around collecting indulgences, that becoming sort of at the forefront of people's spiritual lives. I think once we understand indulgences better, we will find that form of spirituality less attractive, actually. But what I want to say at this stage is that all of these objections are good ones. Right? If the doctrine and practice of indulgences involves any of these three things, there is a problem. What we need to do, if we are to support this doctrine and practice, is not dismiss people's concerns. We ought to take those concerns very seriously. What we need to do is present a picture of the doctrine and practice of indulgences that is more compelling, that is more attractive, and that sits more comfortably with core Christian doctrine. Now, having just said that sits more comfortably with core Christian doctrine, so I keep moving this microphone away from my mouth. I'm really sorry about that. I'll try to do my best to hold it in a decent position. It's really important to be clear, even as we uphold the doctrine and practice of indulgences, that they are not at the centre of our Christian faith. Right? There is a hierarchy of truths, and these are some way down the hierarchy of truths. In terms of our battle with sin and God's merciful response to that battle, the core doctrines are obviously the all-sufficient, justifying victory of Christ over sin and death in the cross and resurrection. and the covenanting of that through the sacraments of baptism and reconciliation. That is the core. Whatever we say about indulgences is secondary to that and sits alongside that as complementary. If we don't realise that, we're already some way down the unhealthy paths I described at the beginning. Nevertheless, in spite of having said all of that stuff, there is an important role for indulgences in Catholic life, and I want to say a little bit about why I think that is now. There was a Prime Minister, I forget which one, there have been so many in recent years. There was a Prime Minister who said, we are all in it together. Now, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, in my opinion, in the context in which that was applied, namely economic life, that is rubbish. Right? It was not true that we were all in it together. However, that phrase, we are all in it together, I think speaks to an important part of Catholic Christian self-understanding. The Apostles' Creed talks about the communion of saints. We believe in the communion of saints. I believe in the communion of saints. And we do believe in the communion of saints. We do believe that we are all in it together. Now, we are on a journey. So Catholics don't think, one thing Catholics don't think, which some of our Protestant brothers and sisters sometimes at least give the impression of thinking, that we let Jesus into our life and then it's all sorted out, right? And we do not think that. We think we're on a lifelong journey with ups and downs, with starts and stops, in which we gradually have the image of Christ formed in ourselves. And that is sometimes a painful journey, that is sometimes a difficult journey. And that journey for most of us doesn't stop with death. The doctrine of purgatory says precisely that this process of purification, as we might call it, continues in our disembodied souls after death. The doctrine of indulgences basically brings these two things together. We are all in it together, and we are on a journey of self-formation. And says, well, look, if we're on a journey of self-formation, the saints, paradigmatically Christ, but also Mary and the saints, work with us in that process of self-purification. They do that in all sorts of ways. So the prayers of the saints would be an obvious example of how the saints help us on our way. There's also the lives, the works, the characters of the saints, what traditionally are called the merits of the saints, also help us on our way. We're not in it on our own, we're in it together with the saints, and they help us. So what does this have to do with indulgences? Well, as I understand an indulgence, there's a twofold collectivity, a twofold sense of community going on with an indulgence. Firstly, it is the church that applies and gives us indulgences. So if there's a transaction going on, and I think we shouldn't understand there as being any transaction going on, in fact, but if there is a transaction going on, it's between the believer and the church. The relationship of the believer to the church, to the whole of God's people throughout time and space, is absolutely central to indulgences. What the church does is applies its power, its authority, to apply the merits of paradigmatically Christ, but also Mary and the saints, to us, so that we're helped by all those others, that cloud of witnesses, as the New Testament puts it, that cloud of witnesses, to journey on our way, to grow in grow in the image of Christ, be formed as a saint, be made into what God wants us to be. And that's what indulgences help us to do. Okay, so far I've talked about commonality, about community, both the community of the church and the wider community of the fellowship of the saints. and said that's what indulgences are about. And that's hopefully quite an attractive picture of indulgences. It's not a superstitious picture, put it like that. It's to do with what we share in common and how we help one another on our journey. There is, I think, a more difficult aspect to the doctrine of indulgences. So what I've said so far, pretty much I would say coheres with the couple of paragraphs you get in the Catechism of the Catholic Church on indulgences. So that those paragraphs major on this idea of the communion of saints and the merits of the saints being applied to us. I think there is a more difficult bit that frankly does sort of not create some of the difficulties I've talked about, but feed those who already have those difficulties. And that is the talk of punishment in relation to indulgences. So I guess the way this language is traditionally used, there is eternal punishment, which we pray to be delivered from, and that's hell. But then there's temporal punishment, and temporal punishment is, as the name suggests, punishment that lasts for a time, but only a time. And we can undergo that in this life, we can undergo that in purgatory. And then the thought is, indulgences remit temporal punishment. Now, I don't for one second misunderstand me. I entirely want to affirm that language in the sense in which it expresses properly Christian doctrine. I think the language is prone to mislead, however. So I think, first of all, thinking of God as punishing is problematic, and not problematic from a sort of contemporary woolly liberal perspective, but from a kind of the perspective of what we might call classical theism, by which I mean the doctrine of God that goes down through the ages. So God is not the kind of thing that I sort of do something to and God reacts with anger. That would be for me to alter or change God. And God is not like that. God is resolute, unchanging, and unchanging in love. But we do talk about punishment. Well, what do we want to say about punishment? Well, I think two things. I think firstly, although we're not being literally punished by God, the language is used metaphorically, and is used metaphorically in an important and indispensable way. That we feel the need, and not just feel the need in a woolly way, deep within us, we feel the need to make up for the sin we have committed. If we're honest with ourselves, we can't just say, oh, I did that, not murdered, I committed adultery, I might have murdered, I've done something seriously wrong, God has forgiven me, therefore that's fine. We feel the need to do something because we want to take God seriously. And that we take upon ourselves is, in a sense, punishment. Regardless of that, there's also a deep desire to punish ourselves from which we need redeeming. I think we often don't like ourselves very much, and sometimes with good reason. But we need redeeming from that, and that's part of our process of growth. So there's this twofold sense of indulgences speaking to punishment. Firstly, they provide us with a means of doing towards God what we feel we should do towards God, namely make up for our sins to the extent that we can do that, of course. But secondly, they redeem us from the damage we do to ourselves. Again, slowly and painfully, not without pitfalls, but in God's grace, over a period of time, we do sort of make up for these things we have done wrong. So to go back to the sort of worries I started with, the first one that these things are open to abuse. Well, yes, they are, but so is pretty much everything in Christian life, to be honest. We can abuse the doctrines we have, we can abuse the practices we have. The way to overcome the abuse of indulgences is firstly, don't do it any longer, which we thankfully don't. Secondly, to explain to people, as I failed to do, actually, I was that person who said the Bishop of Portsmouth was selling indulgences. I was so shocked, I sort of blurted out, "Oh, he's not," which was right. We need to be able to, and this is a great Dominican charism, I think, hopefully, to be able to explain the faith clearly and to say, look, that's not actually what's going on. Here's another way of thinking about this. We need to do that quite painfully, particularly in ecumenical discussions. So I've known sort of particularly Protestant colleagues, actually, who have cottoned on to what's going on in the Jubilee year and are a bit surprised. I remember, so my wife is also a colleague and was talking to another colleague, and my wife was explaining that I'd gone to confession on a particular day and was hoping to gain a plenary indulgence, and this quite evangelical, charismatic friend of ours was sort of shocked by this and said, isn't this transactional? And I'll come on to that in a second, but it's really important to be able to explain these things when the questions come up, because they will come up, especially in a year like this, when it's kind of public that the Catholic Church is seeking indulgences collectively. Being transactional, I mean, I think certainly saying it's not sort of treating God like a vending machine, just denying that's what we're doing is important. But I think the language of sharing rather than the language of transaction is helpful here. So we're not just saying, I do something. I mean, we're doing something because the Church wants to move us to good works and to pious practices, as we would once perhaps still do put it. But really the Church is sharing what gets called the treasury of the Church, all the merits of the saints, all the prayers of the saints, sharing with all of us, rather than sort of dispensing them like in a mechanical way. There's a more sort of human, more sort of communal aspect to it. What was my third objection? It can give rise to unhealthy spirituality. So I think here's an example. If I go to Holy Communion primarily as part of the process of receiving a plenary indulgence, I have seriously misunderstood what Holy Communion is. So what happens in every Mass is infinitely more important than anything I can do in gaining an indulgence. So precisely because of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ, which is made wholly and completely present in every Mass under the sacramental signs. Because of that, the Mass ought to be the cornerstone of our life and practice. There ought to be no doubt about that. Indulgences are something that are there for us if we want them. I want to say we ought to want them, but they're not the cornerstone of our faith. And if we find ourselves getting into this kind of spirituality of somewhat obsessionally collecting indulgences, probably there's a time to reassess. Perhaps there's a role for something like spiritual direction, but yeah, they're important, but they're not of all-encompassing importance. They're not, we ought not to. I keep sounding like I'm having a go at Protestants, and I'm not. Some of my best friends are Protestants, but there is a Protestant accusation that Catholics put things in the way of Christ. So whether that's the saints, whether that's indulgences, whether that's certain pious practices. Now I think that is not true. I think we encounter Christ through those things, but we can sometimes be in danger of making that seem a bit true. by having an unbalanced spirituality. So we ought not to do that. I've been talking for far too long, so on that note I'm going to thank you for listening and hand the microphone back to Margaret.